From the day the Liberals came to power, a small army of gloriously old-fashioned Tory peers had been vetoing almost every attempt at reform. And in 1909, Asquith's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George, was about to ignite one of the greatest political battles of the age, whose result shapes our politics even now. David Lloyd George was the most radical chancellor this country had ever known. He was pledged to bring Britain into a new age of welfare, when wretchedness and human degradation will be as remote to the people of this country as the wolves which once infested its forests. But to the rich, Lloyd George himself was a great deal more dangerous than any wolf. In 1909, recession was looming. Unemployment was rising. With no state pensions or national insurance, Britain was still tormented by Victorian levels of poverty, sickness, and hunger. Lloyd George wanted to pay for welfare reforms by making massive cuts in defence spending. But with fears of a German invasion being stoked by the popular press, he had little room for manoeuvre. Out on the street, patriotic crowds were chanting for the latest awesome war machine, the British-built Dreadnought battleship. We want 8 and we won't wait. Lloyd George's problem was that dreadnoughts were ruinously expensive. To pay both for them and for welfare, he devised what he called his people's budget. He said it was a war budget to wage implacable warfare against poverty and squalidness. To pay for both dreadnoughts and welfare, Lloyd George announced an increase in estate duties, a huge blow to the wealthy. And he also introduced a new super tax for the super rich. The People's Budget was a direct hit on landowners in the Lords, many of them in Lloyd George's own party, and they still had huge power over the elected Commons. Lord Rosebery, an immensely wealthy landowner who'd also been Liberal Prime Minister, described the People's Budget as pure socialism, the negation of faith, of family, of property, of monarchy, of empire. In fact, he said, it wasn't really a budget at all. It was a revolution. And around Britain, the wealthy began the most ferocious campaign. In the newspapers, in the city, among landowners, and in the House of Lords. They even formed the Anti-Budget League. And so, on the evening of July the 30th, 1909, Lloyd George decided he had no choice but to take his people's budget directly to the people. That night, 4,000 men crammed themselves into a former pub called the Edinburgh Castle in the East End of London. The Chancellor of the Exchequer stood up to raucous applause. Many who heard Lloyd George in his prime said he was the greatest orator British politics ever produced, and this was to be the speech of his life. Was it not a shame that a rich country like Britain should allow people who had toiled all their lives to die in penury and starvation? His people's budget, he said, was being opposed by shabby rich men. He needed the money for dreadnoughts, he reminded the audience, and the workmen put in their coppers. But when he went round wealthy Belgravia, there arose such a howl. Well, I tell you, the day of their reckoning is at hand. This was bare-knuckle class warfare. Rumours were already spreading that some landowners were threatening to sack their servants if the People's Budget was passed. Lloyd George was merciless. Are they going to threaten to devastate rural England by feeding and dressing
Themselves? He asked. A typical nobleman needs one man to fix his collar and adjust his tie in the morning, a couple of men to carry a boiled egg to him for his breakfast, a fourth man to open the door for him, a fifth man to help him in and out of his carriage, a sixth and a seventh to drive him. Why, a fully equipped duke costs as much to keep up as 2 dreadnoughts. To his fervent admirers, Lloyd George was the Welsh wizard. He was the Merlin of radical politics. And on that night, he blew on the fire with all his magic dragon might and brought the trouble to boiling point.
But 5 months after his great People's Budget speech, Lloyd George's attempt to balance defence and welfare was still being blocked by the House of Lords. In November 1909, by a huge majority, they finally kicked it out. The first time the Lords had ever rejected a budget. It was an act of suicidal stupidity. And it was Asquith's chance to clip the old buzzard's wings.
Under the British system, the Lords would only lose those powers by voting themselves, a kind of political self-slaughter. Not very likely. And so Asquith asked the king to allow the creation of 400 to 500 new liberal peers. Democracy would swamp aristocracy. Edward VII hated the idea. The man was, after all, a king-emperor. And so to try and delay things, he said to Asquith there'd have to be another special general election first. This concession did not reassure the landed aristocrats. In this chamber, behind gnarled hands where blue blood still flowed, they started to call the king himself a traitor.
1910 would be a year of political turmoil. There would be 2 general elections. The first to break the deadlock on the People's Budget. The second to decide the fate of the House of Lords. The Liberals hung on to power with the backing of 40 Labour MPs and 82 Irish nationalists. The People's Budget was finally passed. Asquith now turned his attention to the House of Lords. His reform bill to cut away their powers of veto wouldn't mean the total abolition of the upper house.
But it did mean that the domination of the House of Commons over this place would be near absolute.
In May, worried old King Edward died. His successor, George V, was just as queasy, but he was afraid the monarchy would be the Liberals' next target. Feeling bullied and with great reluctance, he secretly gave Asquith the promise he'd been looking for. If the government won a second election in December, the king would allow the Lords to be swamped by 500 mass-manufactured Liberal peers. To the king's dismay, the Liberals won that election too.
On the 23rd of July, 1911, Asquith set out for his parliamentary triumph. He had the king's promise to swamp the Lord's chamber with Liberal peers in his pocket. On the short journey, he was cheered by crowds. But when he got into the Commons chamber, Asquith was shouted down by almost berserk Tory MPs chanting, "Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!" and "Who killed the king?" After 45 minutes of this, Asquith gave up and walked out.
But the last of the Romans wasn't going to crack. The Tory party itself was now at daggers drawn, with the leadership calling for surrender. 234 Tory peers eventually agreed to throw in the towel, including Lord Curzon, who'd led the campaign for the defence of aristocratic government.
Curzon said that Anyone who kept fighting deserves to be sent to a lunatic asylum. Willoughby de Brooke preferred Bedlam to Curzon. I am prepared to defend the hereditary principle, he said, whether it be applied to peers or to foxhounds.
After a bitter debate, the vote was going to be very tight. Lord Willoughby de Brooke could see that some of his allies were wavering. Some cowardly souls were even sneaking out of the house.
In a rather desperate attempt to keep one wobbly duke in the chamber for the vote, Willoughby de Brooke stole his top hat and coat. In 1911, it would have been unthinkable for a gentleman to go outside hatless. But the noble peer bolted anyway. He scampered off into the night without his hat. And that's as good an image, perhaps, as we'll get of the final political scuttling of Britannia's aristocratic order.